Hello, this is the RPG Crawler, and we're going to take a look at a tabletop gaming product today, the Ice Kingdoms from Mad Martian Games. This is a project that I believe I mentioned when it was still on Kickstarter, and the PDF recently landed, so I was interested in seeing the result. In a rather happy set of circumstances, they were kind enough to send me a review copy. So now that the disclosures are out of the way, what exactly is the Ice Kingdoms? It's a vaguely Vikingish-inspired sword and sorcery campaign setting designed for older edition role-playing games and similar clones. Written by C.S. Barnhart, James M. Ward, and Chris Lights, among others on the team, it was released in late January 2017. As of this recording, it is available as a PDF for $15 or as a physical copy for $25. This review will address the PDF version. As I mentioned, it is focused on older editions and systems with a similar setup, but it is a campaign setting guide, so most of the contents are actually system neutral. Where statistics are listed, the book does contain notes and procedures for adapting the contents to more modern editions. It's a helpful way of putting this information together, and I, for one, really appreciate it. When I first saw this on Kickstarter, I'll admit I was more than a little excited, although budgetary issues at the time kept me from backing it. An old-school style setting built for old-school editions and retro clones, with a Norse look and feel, just seemed to push all of the right buttons for me. But now I've actually read through it, and I can see that the Ice Kingdoms also includes a number of callbacks to classic sword and sorcery, mingling the Viking theme with dashes of Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser, Conan, and other classics, partly in the feel of things, and partly with veiled and sometimes not-so-veiled references. Fans of the genre will be able to pick them out readily. So with that admittedly awesome setup, does the setting live up to it? Well, let's take a look at what the main book contains. As usual, I'll be giving a general overview of the contents, and then my thoughts at the end. It all starts with a foreword by Ernest Gary Gygax Jr., which helps to set the tone of what to expect, but my God, get that man some editing stat! Although he does do a very good job introducing the theme and feel of the material, and I appreciate the old-school gravitas that he helps by starting things off. Chapter 1 is a brief overview of the setting and goes into how the cold climate, despite being central to the setting overall, should not be used as some mercilessly constant test of character survival, which I guess is fitting, although later on in the book they go even further into detail about the weather. While they don't directly contradict the idea of hand-waving a lot of that away, they certainly give the DM all the tools that they need in order to make the cold and harsh wilderness as threatening as they need to. Then there's some basic discussion over the fantasy races that are available, the roles of government and the gender in the setting, and it all serves as a good primer for further information that is developed more later. The chapter closes by making it clear that the setting is designed for OSR-style games, and can be used with more modern systems, which I've, talked about before. Now, before we get to Chapter 2, we get our first part of the intermission story. A lot of the chapters are divided by these single-page portions of an overarching short story involving Rolfgar, warrior elder of the Huskarls of Arfherheim. I think I'm pronouncing that right. I don't think the story is ever actually concluded, which is a shame, but it is terribly interesting while it goes on, and it gives some insight into elements that you might expect of an adventure in the setting, as well as background on one of the movers and shakers in the setting itself. Anyway, on to Chapter 2. There's a long history of the origins of the Ice Kingdoms of the Thanelands, and their place in the conflicts in the world of Eärden, covering over 1,000 years prior, up to just before the start of the setting's adventures. It's really interesting read, all in all, and I'll admit I got kind of bogged down admiring all of the details that are given, but for those who are more interested in just the highlights, there's also a sidebar that covers basically just a quick reference chart of what has happened. Now, I'm not going to go into the details of it all, but the timeline does stretch from the mythical origins of the Thanelands, from a slave people scrambling from the ruins of an ancient empire of the Dragon Elves, through the formation of their tribes and their various factions, to the rise of Arfherd, and then beyond. It introduces a number of mythical and semi-mythical figures, some of which are fairly obvious references to characters from classic swords and sorcery stories, albeit sometimes mixed and matched, and usually with names changed just enough to get by. And you know what? I'm okay with that. I'm really okay with that. Even the character of Arfred brings to mind the character of Fafhrd. I can't pronounce either one properly, and I don't think anybody can. Chapter 3 covers the basics of the general culture, including social status, clans, typical government and military organizations, the laws, and so forth. It goes into the manner of dress, diet, and food production, sports, entertainment, trade goods, and the usual assortment of adventuring gear like weapons and vehicles. Most of these are left to the core games in terms of statistics, although there is a table that tells of the costs of some basic trade goods, as well as conversion rates between the different levels of coinage available in the Thanelands. This chapter closes out with a list of ships, with basic characteristics described in game terms, as well as some guidelines on ship-based exploration and dangers of the sea. The latter is pretty necessary, as many old-school games skim over it at best, and both the culture and geography of this particular setting makes seagoing likely at some point. Now, one thing of interest that's mentioned in this chapter, and elaborated on later in the book, is the idea that, aside from the broad areas where the various clans hold sway, and a handful of old and well-developed towns and cities, there's many, many smaller kingdoms and warlords scattered throughout the area, ones that can rise and fall in a single generation or even just a few years. This allows for a dungeon master or similar game master to design their own little pocket of the world, and not really worry much about stepping on any official toes, so to speak. And I like that, since it gives both the freedom of creation while still providing a fleshed-out cultural background that can be applied to these individual mini-kingdoms. Whereas the prior chapters mostly steered away from actual hard number crunching or in-game rules, with only the seamanship check really system-specific, Chapter 4 delves into the mechanics of character generation for the Ice Kingdom setting. And although it has ample lore tucked away in this chapter, the necessary die rolls and adjustments to create and run a character in this setting are all included here. They very much follow the ideas of early edition RPGs and similar OSR setups, although there is, as usual, a sidebar that offers hints and tips for 3rd edition and later games. Now, this particular chapter is notable because of the differences that it brings to even early editions of the game. And, like several other places in this book, it starts off kind of contradicting itself. The ability score generation suggests that the 4d6 drop the lowest method is preferred, and then immediately recommends the classic 3d6 straight down the line roll, before commenting that the 4d6 method, at most, would be acceptable. I'm bringing this up here, and I'll get this back to it later, but this is one of the main criticisms I have with this product overall. There are several places, mostly really minor, but they are noticeable, where the setting information and the suggestions contradict themselves. It seems like the draft was prepared geared towards one particular style of campaign, and then later they loosened up on it, and didn't properly update all of the references. I don't know if it's fixed in a later version of the product. The review copy I was given seems to be the one associated with the Kickstarter itself, so if it's fixed in a later version, then feel free to ignore this complaint altogether. Here's the thing. Even if these contradictions still exist, the beautiful part about the older editions is that you can just pick one way and then run with it. The OSR-style games very much encourage that sort of on-the-fly ruling, so the Ice Kingdoms can be as harsh or as heroic as you want them to be. Anyway, back to character generation. Rather than the half-dozen or so demi-human races that a lot of the old-school games may give you, the Ice Kingdom game gives you 6 human sub-races representing major clan groups, and then dwarves. The lack of gnomes is explained by their extreme rarity, while the elves themselves are considered evil tricksters, whose empire once dominated humans and kept them as slaves. What elves are left are kind of half-spirit creatures, with more abilities than the generic fantasy elf, and therefore unsuitable for play. Still, the human clans and the dwarves offer a good range of different archetypes suitable for the setting and for general types of play. The Einherjar are considered the standard and most widespread of humans. The Fenrir and the Urson are more primitive clans associated with wolves and bears respectively. They tend to be geared towards warrior druids and wilderness survival. The Hirdu are a nomadic clan that wanders around the land in caravans and possesses skills as a seer. The Pojolan are a people of any other clan who are then born with a kind of inner corruption, a touch of shadow that tells of a dark fate. But if you want to go completely off the rails, there's also the savage Varyag, who live in the wilds and are actually cannibalistic. Finally, there's the dwarves, or the Grugni, which are, well, dwarves, about what you would expect of most fantasy races. So the interesting thing is that each of these subraces has a pretty large range of ability bonuses and penalties across the normal 6 that you'd find in any retro clone. However, there's additional adjustments for age at the young adult and mature categories, which means that an initial character might have a fair few bonuses and to different scores just at character generation. Further, this same chapter indicates that in this setting, all characters get additional ability score bonuses at certain levels, similar to how they operate in 3rd edition. So even with a straight 3d6 roll as one of the recommendations suggests, you can probably end up with a pretty heroic ability score combination just by the end of character creation. Some changes are made to character advancement and multiclassing as well. Since most of the character races are just subraces of humans, dual classing has been made easier, and since the setting focuses on martial classes, thieves and fighters can switch between those two classes a lot more easily than between other classes. Furthermore, the rules of this setting allow demi-human style multiclassing for certain humans, although only for specific sets of classes and with particular limitations, especially with regard to the wizard class. This does offer a lot more flexibility while still focusing on martially oriented characters, as is appropriate for a sword and sorcery setting. There's new level limits which keep anyone from reaching the usual highest levels available in the OSR games this is designed for, but they do allow for a fair amount of advancement within the game underneath that. There's certain classes which are considered rare within this setting, while others are specific to the setting and worth mentioning. There are sorcerers, which are less of a class on their own and more of kind of a build, combining wizard and cleric abilities in a particular way. Clerics and druids, and wizards for that matter, can also utilize rune magic, described in the next chapter, and druids get their abilities somewhat modified. Totemic monks function as this setting's version of monks, but they function in a way kind of like a specialty priest, receiving granted powers but also special limitations. Finally, there's Valagard Paladins, which are kind of more of an adjustment on an existing class combination rather than their own standalone class, and they really only function for the duration of a particular quest, after which their powers go away. Chapter 5 covers magic in the setting, and there are some thematic differences between the Ice Kingdoms and generic fantasy games. This includes rune magic, which not only functions as a general replacement for material components for some classes, but also enables runecasters, a specific method of spellcasting that grants special abilities, including imbuing items with enchanted runes, creating sort of limited magic items. This same chapter talks about the languages in the region, and gives rules for making translations between the different dialects more difficult if you want to add that to the game. It's an interesting concept, and it's recommended to be used only during certain events when miscommunication can advance the plot. Finally, the chapter closes out with a list of new magical spells and items suitable for the region. They're balanced and geared towards the OSR style of games, and presented in a format where they can be plugged into the appropriate list of a number of different editions. Chapter 6 goes back to lore, and it covers the mythology of the region, the legends, and the origin of certain supernatural creatures. There's no hard game rules in here, but it is recommended reading if you're going to run the game, and honestly, I'd like to see some of this in a sort of player's guide, because there's another quirk of this particular setting. It's based on Viking and Nordic mythology, but there's some changes, some additions of splashes of Greek and Celtic ideas in there, and even those gods and legends which are really heavily based on the actual Norse myths often have names and relations between the gods somewhat changed, just enough to throw off somebody who's going in assuming that the usual pantheon of Nordic deities is exactly as presented. That having been said, the legends here are really interesting, and they are plenty of fodder for a good game master to base an entire campaign on them. The next chapter, 7, goes back to game details, in that it presents not only the specific gods, but also their priesthoods and their temples. This is where you'd look if you want to play a cleric or other priest type. There's all of the information that you should need to fit in the priesthoods in pretty much any of the old editions, with enough adjustment information to even fit them into newer modern systems. The list covers all of the gods and priesthoods native to the setting, even the evil ones, which can be useful not only for PCs of questionable alignment, but also the construction of NPCs foes for the party to fight. And again, the lore of this section is useful to show the differences between the Ice Kingdom's pantheon and the real-world Norse mythology. Coming towards the end, Chapter 8 covers the geography of the region, detailing the general geography and then focusing on each domain in question. As I mentioned earlier, the individual kingdoms and sub-kingdoms aren't usually enumerated, but the large cities are, and the areas and domains are defined by the large city or clan group that's in the area. Each of these areas has a slightly different set of cultural backgrounds that fit within the main umbrella of the Thanelands, so it's useful for defining individual towns within the regions listed. Furthermore, a list of points of interest, both mythological and physical, are listed afterward, many of which could be outstanding adventure areas. Finally, the end of the geography chapter has an entire system for determining the weather in a particular area, and this actually ends up giving really realistic results for the various areas without being too complex as to be unworkable. It's basically a series of charts divided by region with temperatures and weather states, where a die roll modified by the month tells you a range of temperatures and what precipitation is likely that day. I tried it out a few times, and it ended up being pretty quick in practice, giving each region its own feel. Chapter 9 goes into details about Arfordheim, the city founded by Arford, which, while not actually the capital of the area, is a large city, and considered the rightful ancestral home for all of the humans in the area. And I use the term large loosely, because the population is stated to be vary between 1,000 and several thousand depending on the time of year. The cold climate and dangerous bare terrain means that truly large cities are just not going to happen in this area. Several pages go into detail about the city, its regions, its history, and its current political outlook. Because Arfordheim is the center of intrigue in the area, if your party is interested in mixing political play with their classic sword and sorcery, this is likely the place they're going to want to come to. The last chapter before the appendices, Chapter 10, covers the creatures and plants native to the area, flora and fauna of the Ice Kingdoms. It's not an exhaustive bestiary, but it gives a good breakdown of various sorts of monsters you'd find in the region, how they differ culturally from similar monsters in other lands, and then a few mentions of common animals and a list of trees that you'd find in the region. It's pretty short for the amount of information involved, but invaluable for providing specific details that you'd use in descriptions of the landscape as the party travels through it, especially if you're not familiar with that sort of climate. The appendices delve back into hard gaming statistics. Appendix A gives conversion notes for the various RPG editions that this setting can be used with, especially useful since old editions, even old editions, vary on what they include. Appendix B is a bestiary, including monster statistics in old-school format for the various new creatures in the region. Appendix C is a list of potential adventure hooks to inspire DMs using the Ice Kingdoms in their own campaigns, while Appendix D covers the various clerical spheres and lists the spells that might fall into each, as well as what retroclone or edition these spells are taken from. Appendix E is kind of like a cultural fact sheet, offering a scattering of local information that can be used to spice up play, such as the names of the days of the week, constellations, etc. Appendix F includes a physical and cosmological description of the world of Eordan, the planet where the Ice Kingdoms are set, as well as the celestial bodies around it. Then there's the appendix numbering that skips all the way to N, which reflects the classic Appendix N reading list with a list of OSR and modern systems that might be compatible with a little bit of adaptation with the Ice Kingdoms. And finally, there's the open gaming license and legal info at the end, followed by an index and a list of Kickstarter backers. So we're looking at about 200 pages of content, most of which is actually system neutral, despite the focus on old school editions. Sure, the monster types listed in the bestiary might need to be adapted, and yes, the individual character subraces could probably use some rebalancing for more modern systems, but all in all, this conversion process is not that hard. In the time it took me to write this up, I already made a few notes on how I might run it with a 5th edition game. In general, the content is really solid. It's backed up with art that resembles the sort of line art that you'd find in an older edition setting. It's tasteful, and while there's only a few pieces that are really outstanding, none are at that goofy level that you'd see in, say, early 1st edition or original white box level. So yes, the art fits the theme and the product pretty well. Organizationally, I didn't really see anything out of place. Most of the content is setting specific rather than system dependent, so there's not a lot of chasing around after various rules. I could see maybe moving the seafaring rules and the weather generation into their own subchapter rather than where they're placed tagged onto other settings. But apart from that, I've got no complaints about the layout and organization. Information is easily accessible and it's a relatively easy read. The editing probably could be a little bit more consistent. There's only a few places in there where it might be noticeable, and maybe it's just me catching things off the cuff. It really didn't detract from the product, and as I said, the review copy I got is apparently the one associated with the Kickstarter, so some of these issues might have been fixed. But even if they haven't, I've seen worse in printed Wizards of the Coast products, so I'm going to give the editing a pass on this. It does the job. They might do a little bit better on it if they have another printing or whatever, but, it gets the job done. As far as prepared adventures, I was provided one to review, and I will get a review out on it soon, but I like to keep the setting and the adventures for that setting separate when I can, at least in terms of consideration. If you're worried about not having such content, know that they've got one out already, and they've got, I think, 2 more in progress as of the time of this recording. So they've got some product coming. But for me, the setting itself is the important part. So what did I think about it overall? This setting's pretty badass. I mean, yeah, I know I tend to run positive on some of the stuff I review, but thematically, in terms of genre, in terms of the feel and the lore, I want to run a campaign in this setting, and the fact that I'm already up in my eyeballs on other products is the only thing keeping me from grabbing my books off the shelf right now, and yes, bastardizing it for 5th edition, because that's likely how I get my players into it, but it really doesn't strike me as that difficult of a task. I want to run this setting, and I'm very, very glad I looked into it. The real question is it worth it for you? That depends on whether you enjoy the genre and the themes. If sword and sorcery style fantasy or old school stylings aren't your thing, then this is probably not going to convince you, and you're probably going to be able to give it a miss. However, if you're into low to mid-style fantasy settings, or any kind of Viking-related material, then you're probably going to find yourself square in the target audience for this. For me, at least, the $15 for the PDF would be well worth it. $25 for the hard copy, pretty tempting, and who knows, you may see an edition of the book on the bookshelf if I can line up the players who might be interested. I know I've paid more than that for some of the stuff that you see up there that I've used that I think I would use less. Anyway, on that note, I'm going to leave it here. I'm going to put links below where you can pick this up, just down in the description if it seems like something that you'd be interested in. This has been the RPG Crawler with my review of the Ice Kingdoms campaign setting. If you like what you've seen, remember to leave a like, comment if you've got feedback, and subscribe for more RPG content. If you want to help to support this channel's content, have a say in future products, and have early access to reviews and specials that I do, please consider backing me on Patreon at patreon.com/rpgcrawler or through the links at the end of the video or in the description below. Until next time, take care and goodbye.